Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for the Grantcycle Collective Live. My name is Ansley Fender, and I am the founder and CEO of Grantcycle, which is a grant management software platform that helps grant funders and recipients in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors collaboratively manage their funding and articulate their impact. So today I have the pleasure of talking with Remer Brinson, the CEO of Good Plan, which is a strategic planning firm that helps nonprofits and foundations get clarity on how they create impact. Remer, thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So, we see a lot of organizations that are turning to grants when there are income shortfalls, thinking that that's going to be a lifeline. But the reality is that managing grants is really hard and it can reveal foundational deficiencies that just get bigger when you have more money. So, I want to start by talking about what needs to go on inside an organization before grants are even identified as a funding target. So, how do you prepare internally?
That's a really great question. And I agree with kind of what you've noticed that a lot of times organizations are looking for grant funding as a lifeline, but really grant funders are very strategic organizations and they're looking for grantees that really align with their values and with their desired impact. So, in order to secure grants, the organization itself really has to get clear on what is its core strategy. That's a lot of the kind of work that we do at Good Plan is organizational strategic planning. So it could be a formal strategic plan like the one that we run organizations through, and that could be organization wide. That would be ideal if you were really clear kind of what the whole organizational strategy was. But at a minimum, you've got to have a really clear program strategy, which is a little different than organizational strategies. Organizational strategies, the way the whole organization operates, how marketing and operations and programming and leadership all fit together. That would be ideal. But at a minimum, we need to make sure that the program strategy is really buttoned up and that you have a clear theory of change and way that you're going to implement the strategy so that when you're going to the funder, you're really aligned with the goals that they're trying to accomplish and you become a clear opportunity for the funder to be a partner to grow your shared impact.
So, why do you think people skip over this step?
Let's be honest, nonprofit work is the hardest work there is, in my opinion. I mean, organizations who are building out these programs or building out programs that the market, there's not a ton of money to be made. A market solution hasn't been invented to solve this challenge. You're oftentimes working against some sort of social pressure against this issue. Maybe you're trying to get people on board. Maybe you're trying to convince people that the issue that you care about matters. So, to begin with, a lot of times it is just the nature of nonprofit work, and it's noble and to fault for it. Organizations have an important mission that they're trying to accomplish, and they see that there's funding out there. So, they're going for it and they're trying to figure out how to fund their mission. So, I think a lot of it is more about urgency than anything else. What I often tell organizations is while your issue is urgent, and so we need to move quickly, you will be able to go further faster if you slow down for a minute and get clear on what you're trying to go after. Which kind of brings up a different point is that a lot of times people approach foundations really transactionally. And there is a more transactional element to grant funding than maybe to major gift funding or crowd funding, where you really are having relationships with the individual donors. But grant funding is also a relationship driven funding process. And so go to a funder at a little bit of a slower pace with a clear strategy in place. You're urgent to fund your mission, but if you can slow down a bit and plan ahead where you're not coming so last minute or so urgently, it allows for the relationship to develop more and it allows for a more reciprocal relationship with foundation funders.
I think so many people think of this sort of like Daddy Warbucks and Annie sort of relationship where you're just the poor nonprofit and there's this huge being who's just going to bestow wealth on you. And it's like they want to be involved. That whole ivory tower thing, I think we're moving away from that, which I think is great. And so these foundations, these funders, they want to be boots on the ground with you. They are just as invested in your impact as you are. So creating that relationship and getting them really excited about what you're doing has huge benefits, not just short term for funding, but you get them on board with you at the beginning. They could potentially help you fund that indefinitely. So, in your work, where do you see most of the problems happening? Are they managerial or with the board? Are they financial? Is it a combination of everything? Where are the biggest areas for strategic planning?
There's lots of different ways that you can approach strategic planning. And I always start trying to kind of understand what the life cycle of the organization is. So, is it a brand new organization that is just trying to kind of figure out what is its theory of change? And when I say theory of change, I mean, how does it expect the work that it does to change the world in some way? So there's some situation, there's some problem, there's some opportunity in the world, and this organization can partner or step in and provide some sort of solution that creates change. So that's what I mean by theory of change. So, what is the theory of change of the organization, and how do you put a team in place and get some initial funding around it and develop some of the initial programming? So let's talk about that one first. So those are kind of what I would classify as a grassroots nonprofit. So a lot of time there, it is about identity formation, program clarity, building relationships with some key donors, and getting the thing spinning and iterating and getting something going. So in those organizations, there's probably a lot of operational inefficiency because it's normally a small group of people and they're doing the best they can and they're wearing a lot of hats. And you can't really build much of a strategic plan for operational efficiency because it is kind of an all hands on deck sort of a situation. So a lot of those strategic plans, I focus on identity formation. So, who are we? What are we going to accomplish in the world? Who do we want to be? How big do we want to grow? Where are we operating? Are we an issues based organization that's working on this issue wherever this issue exists? Are we a place based organization that's operating in a particular neighborhood or city or state? What's our business model? Are we trying to be grant funded, federally funded, or state funded? Are we funded through people who care about this cause because this is a cause that touches a lot of people's hearts and we think we can raise money broadly for it? So that's kind of what I would focus on for what I classify as startup or grassroots. A lot of my work is in the next bucket of nonprofits that I call a professional nonprofit. That process from going from grassroots to professional is kind of the professionalization process. And a lot of our strategic plans there really focus on some operational efficiency. So we have figured out our identity, we've figured out our business model. Now, how do we market it? How do we create some efficiencies in how we do our accounting and make sure that we followed all due diligence in terms of financial management and ensuring that we can build donor trust? And then how do we build our donor base to a broader group of people? And then the third category is a scaling nonprofit. So it's a nonprofit that has already professionalized its services, it knows who it is, it knows how it's going to get it done, and now it's trying to figure out how to replicate the same model in new locations, or they want to continue operating in the same location, but now they want to try their hand at something else. So, our theory of change for this program was X. That has been successful, but it's left room for improvement in this way. So, we're going to bring on a new program that'll address that kind of externality that we hadn't planned for originally. So, those organizations, that's a lot of innovation, a lot of scale work, and a lot of catalytic growth.
Sometimes the hard part about this is convincing the board or your executive director or your grant writers to really believe that this is an important thing. So, how do you get everyone rowing the same direction to understand that this is a need and this is something that time should be spent on?
That's a great question. A lot of my strategic planning work is also coaching work. And so when I do a lot of staff coaching and organizational coaching, it's not my idea. It's just a coaching idea
Sure.
in terms of like leading down, leading sideways, and leading up. So each of us in our area of leadership, we have influence on those that we direct, those that we collaborate with, and those that we report to. So a lot of that beginning work is building consensus that action needs to be taken here. You can spend a lot of energy trying to put grants together without full team collaboration and agreement of direction. Not that that can't be done, and there might be situations where you just kind of have to barrel through something, but that's not the most efficient way to work, and you're not going to get the best grant proposal together. So if I was a manager in an organization or grant manager and I wanted to elevate the value of grants. I think some of the things that I would do is educate people in the organization about how grant processes work, timeline, set expectation around how much forward planning it takes to get significant grants. I would also really elevate the value of collaboration and coordination, and that
Sure.
a grant manager's job isn't necessarily to develop the program, but if the grant manager is sitting by themselves trying to piecemeal an application together without collaboration with the program's team, that can start happening. So, what you really want to do is elevate the value of collaboration so that it really is a team effort. And the grants team is the one quarterbacking this effort, and they're moving it through all the different teams. Like, has program spoken into this? Has leadership spoken into this? Have we talked to the finance team about how we'll manage this and if this is of strategic value to us? And then the last thing I would do is I think I would go and do some research on similar organizations who have received some of the types of grants that I want to
Sure.
apply to, and maybe even set up calls with those organizations. I find that just reaching out to other organizations is a great way to learn about what's worked for them, and then sharing that back with my leadership in my organization to say, hey, these organizations that we all know of, they've received some of these sorts of grants that are the ones that I'm looking at, whether it's the exact grant or a similar one, and here's what's been the pros and cons for them. Everything I just said had nothing to do with grant application. Everything I just said has to do a
Yeah,
lot with consensus building and some organizational agreement that grant funding is a significant strategy. And in order to capitalize on that opportunity, we can't do it last minute. Here's what we need to do in order to realize that opportunity. Because, yes, the payoff for winning a big grant is huge, but it is not without an opportunity cost. Putting grant proposals together and applying takes a lot of time.
for sure.
So, really figuring out that the organization is ready to invest that time
Sure.
is an important first step.
Absolutely. I've also seen lots of cases where organizations say, "Hey, we're going to go after this grant that requires us to have this type of program. We don't have that, but we want the funding because we want to use some of it for other stuff. So let's just create a program." I think I probably know how you feel about this based on what we've talked about so far, but I also understand that sometimes there's competing needs here. Yes, this is a $500,000 grant. I can use a good chunk of that on capacity building type of things, but I am going to have to create this program to make it happen. So, can you talk a little bit about why that may or may not be a good thing to do, but also how creating this plan and really getting clear on your organization can help make the decision about whether or not you should do something like that?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Let me take one step back and say something that I tell people in strategic planning often, which is there's normally not one right answer to what is the best strategy for an organization. There are some things that are just like best practice, and it's just clear every
Sure.
organization should be doing this. But when you get to the work that I'm doing with a lot of clients, which is kind of organization, kind of corporate strategy work, there's normally not one right answer. It is a series of decisions that you're making. Hey, we think the world is going to look like this. We think that we are good at that. And so, because of that, we're going to make these set of decisions that are strategic for us. So, that's the first thing I want to say. So, I'm going to build on that idea, going back to your question in terms of should you apply for a grant that's not a program that you're running? Yeah, if the program is just totally outside of anything that your organization is doing, and you can't with fidelity say that you can do it well, and you
Sure.
can't with fidelity say it's not going to take you off course, then you should not apply for that. You should just let that one rest and go find something else. Most of the time, though, grants will be in a gray area, going back to my
Sure.
first point, that it's kind of, well, what if we might be good at this, or this might be strategic for us? We've never had the opportunity, and now we're presented with the opportunity. So the first thing I would say is evaluate the opportunity. Is this a program that you would want to run? If you were going to run it, how would you run it? How would it affect the rest of the organization? Run that analysis either formally or conversationally. If the answer is, yeah, we should give this a shot, then I would move forward with it. I've written plenty of grants that weren't with programs that I had exactly done before because the organization had never had an opportunity to grow in that way.
Right.
Let me add one more point here. Most funders have some sort of strategic parameters in which they need to operate. So I do find that sometimes when there are things that might be a new type of program for us, that's just something to talk about the funder about.
Sure.
Oftentimes, funders are looking for innovative solutions. So if you think that you can create an innovative solution, even though it's not something that you've done before, but you feel like you have the capacity to do it and you feel like it's within your mission and not going to, tank the organization in some other direction, then yeah, I would use that opportunity to innovate, and I would work with the grant funder, the program manager at the foundation, if I had access to them, to talk about that. I would always be clear though. There's no fake it till you make it. I would be clear that this is an innovation for us, and I would prove our case. We've been successful in these ways, which leads me to believe we'll be successful in this new innovative program. And that has been successful for me in the past.
So there's so much work that goes into all of this. There's cost, there's time. Strategic planning is a lift. So once you've done the legwork, you've identified we do want to apply for these grants, how can grant writers leverage all of that learning, all of that knowledge, all of that professionalization and development in the actual grant application? How do you highlight that? Because it does put you ahead of other organizations who have not done that work. So, how do you make that really, really clear in your applications?
Well, some applications will allow you to include attachments. So if you have a formal strategic plan and there's opportunities to include attachments, I might include the whole thing or a part of the thing and highlight how the grant fits into that. Also, as you develop a whole body of work of strategic plans, fundraising cases for support, applications for grants, I would start building out kind of core messaging and language that's consistent across all of
Right.
those, and I would recycle. There is no need to write everything from scratch every time. I'm not suggesting that you just copy paste without making sure that it's relevant to the question, but there's a lot of power in having a consistent strategic message, just like there's power in having a strategic marketing message. So even though this document will be read by a handful of people, I'd be really consistent with my language to make sure that
Sure.
what they're seeing on my website, what they're seeing on my strategic plan, what they're seeing in my grant application is a really clear through line. That's a really great way to take advantage of the hard work that's already been accomplished.
Absolutely. Is there a way to apply for grants that will help fund strategic planning and strategy building?
That's a great question. There's a couple different types of grants for that. There are things called capacity building grants. So that is a great thing to talk to funders that you know about. Depending on your size, you should for sure talk to your community foundation. A lot of communities have their own community foundation. If your community is a community that doesn't have a community foundation, then I would encourage you to reach out to the closest community foundation near you. I've worked with a couple different community foundations and have a lot of love for community foundations. They're a great resource in this way. They don't always have capacity building grants, but they oftentimes do, or they oftentimes might be familiar with someone who does, and they oftentimes have people on staff who can do some of this work or at least point you in the right direction. But if you're applying to a larger private foundation, yes, there are things called capacity building grants or planning grants. So you could search for those. The other thing that you could consider is if you have a significant grant from a funder and you're doing great work with them and you've got a good rapport building, perhaps that work that you're doing with them is like a very specific programmatic commitment. You could approach that funding relationship and say, hey, we'd love to go deeper with you all. We've got some of these strategic priorities that are going to help the work you're already funding, but also help elevate the whole organization. Do you all have a process for considering planning grants or capacity building grants? Sometimes funders have those more privately available than
Sure.
through a public RFP process. So I would definitely keep that in mind as well.
I want to take a little bit of a step back and ask you about strategies, frameworks, ways that people can get started, maybe a little bit less formally in this strategic planning process.
The core part of a strategic plan always starts with your mission, vision, values. So make sure that you're clear on your mission, vision, values. I could go into more detail, but I'm going to keep
For sure.
moving through the framework since we only have a few minutes. The next thing that I would really focus on is what are your core programs? The thing that I tell a lot of my clients is, especially those organizations in that kind of grassroots and going along the professionalizing realm, is that professional nonprofits do not do all things for all people. So you do at some point have to start decreasing certain programming areas in order to increase in others. So I do encourage people through the strategic planning process to really take a hard look at historic programming. Never just leave something high and dry. If you're serving people and they're counting on you, that needs
For
to be
sure.
a thoughtful process in terms of how you change the program strategy. But professionalized and scaling nonprofits do not 15 different ways that they are working in communities. They have some targeted interventions that they've
For
really
sure.
built capacity around. So that's the next thing that I would tell people to really take a look at. The last thing I would tell people to take a look at is their business model. So, really thinking through doing some historical review, work with your accountant, look at your historical numbers in terms of, broadly, how have we funded ourselves through revenue from services, through donors, what type of donors, from major gifts from donors, and then grants. Really think through that and evaluate how would you grow each of those revenue streams. Do you think that you can? Do you think one is better suited to your future or the other? And then start building some unique funding strategies and shift the business model accordingly.
Awesome. Obviously, the strategic plan is a living document, but things have a way of changing. So, when good to start thinking about, should we revise this? Is there mission drift, or there is mission drift and it was on purpose and now we need to reevaluate this? So, what are sort of the factors that go into, hey, maybe we should take a look at the strategic plan or start a brand new one and see where that takes us?
A lot of my clients are asking me that question right now because we're still coming out of the pandemic for a
For
lot of
sure.
nonprofits. So, the pandemic, we all had to innovate, we all had to pivot, and then we had to sustain a lot of the work that we were doing. And now is the time that a lot of organizations are saying, wow, we grew in some really unique ways, we let some things fall behind. Now we need to figure out, are we going to continue the stuff that we picked up in the pandemic? Are we going to go back to the stuff that kind of fell off the plate during the pandemic? Even though it's years after the pandemic, that work is happening now. A lot of my clients and I are talking about that. So if you are asking those sorts of questions, it's a great time to do strategic planning. Other times that it's the right time to do strategic planning is if you're at big points of pivot and transition. I'd encourage you all to check out my website, which is goodplan.co. And right there on the homepage, there's 6 or 7 different kind of transitions and pivots that we
For sure.
help people through. Leadership changes, big changes in funding, big changes in the issue that we care about. So if any of those fundamental pivots had happened, it's a good time to do strategic planning. And then the third thing I would say is if you just feel like the organization's core questions, if you're asking foundational or core questions about the direction of the organization, like, should we be involved in that any longer? Should we be working in this way anymore? Should we be focused? Any of those sorts of kind of higher level questions that every other question kind of links into and is
Sure.
dependent on, that's the perfect time to do strategic planning.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you. This has been super helpful. Remer, thank you so much for joining us today. If anyone listening wants to get in contact with you, where is the best place for them to find you or interact with you?
Yeah, goodplan.co is the best place to reach out to me. There's a booking link on there. I would love to talk with any of you. You can find out all about our work and the stuff that we do at goodplan.co. And then you can also find me at LinkedIn.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Remer. We will see you all again next month. Have a good
Thank
one.
you so much. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.